Hi, my name is Ben. I'm 27 years old and I'm doing a series of videos to provide as much insight as I can into what it's like to develop and live with schizophrenia. This is my first video, during which I'm going to give a general overview of my experience developing the illness myself. I'll say that I also live with a Tourette's-like condition, which I will discuss a little bit, but my primary focus is going to be on the schizophrenia. Some of the symptoms I've experienced are fairly rare, and I haven't seen too many online materials that touch on all of them. So I'll be interested to know in the comments section whether anyone else has experienced some of these more rare symptoms that I'll speak about. I'll also start by saying I'm quite lucky. Whilst I've had 2 psychotic episodes, I've basically fully recovered. I have almost zero positive symptoms, but I do have some residual negative symptoms and cognitive symptoms. I'm also still on medication and therefore experience side effects. With that in mind, my videos will be most relevant to those who've just had a couple of episodes and who've recovered quite well. So a bit about me before my illness. I grew up loving sport, the music and the sciences. Grew up very socially anxious, a little bit awkward, but was always very energetic and very motivated. I studied electrical engineering at university. I entered the workforce as a management consultant. I've always had a huge amount of nervous energy, always worked on things, lived a very high stress lifestyle as a result. Probably worked myself 12 to 14 hours a day plus weekends doing various projects. And however, whilst I did live a high stress lifestyle, I was always very health conscious. Always took steps aimed at benefiting my physical and mental health, which I think is an important point. To expand upon my life before my illness, there were a couple of signs of some sort of predisposition, or signs of having a slightly funky brain chemistry. One of them was that as I grew up, I often had episodes of delirium in the middle of the night. I'd often wake up in a confused, fearful state. I had a particularly bad one when I was about 18 years old, where I was in a hotel room actually, and I fell asleep watching The Matrix. Woke up 30 minutes later thinking I was actually in the Matrix with people running after me. Almost a little bit like a psychotic episode, but the symptoms fully receded within about 10 minutes and I came completely back to reality. I'd been very dehydrated and sick with a cold at the time, which I think was what had triggered it. The other sign of some sort of predisposition was my Tourette's-like illness. I say Tourette's-like because it's not been properly diagnosed, but it did get progressively worse approaching my psychotic episode. And it's a sign of slightly unusual wiring or abnormal brain chemistry. Now I'll talk about my experience with psychosis itself. And as I talk about this, I'm going to refer to the following graph, which shows how bad my combined positive, negative, cognitive symptoms and medication side effects were over time. So what were the months like leading up to my first episode of psychosis? And for context, we're in COVID-19 lockdown at the time and my stress levels were at an all-time high. But thinking about those months, I can definitely identify a number of early warning signs. Number 1, I had a strange fuzziness in the right hemisphere of my head. My memory was also getting worse. I was sweating a lot, and I was actually showering about 3 times per day. I was having some mild but increasingly delusional thinking, and I can only identify that in retrospect. My Tourette's-like symptoms were getting really bad, and I was having lots of really bad, loud outbursts. I was also generally very hypersensitive. So I was hypersensitive to sugar, hypersensitive to alcohol, hypersensitive to not getting enough sleep. I was also getting anxious about things very easily. I was also having some extreme mood swings that ranged between extreme highs and extreme lows. It was really a couple of days before my hospitalization that things really started to kick off. A couple of days before, I was watching a work presentation online over Zoom being attended by a couple of hundred people. And towards the end of the presentation, I thought that the presentation was speaking to me personally, but in a subtle way that the other 100 people on the call wouldn't notice. Almost like secret messages were being dropped into the script. And after that, on a couple of other work calls, I started to think that people were acting my behaviour back at me, like they were mirroring me in some way. This seemed very real, and over the coming days I started to become very worried as to what this all meant. I actually thought that it might mean I was going to be fired. Then came the day of my hospitalisation when things got a lot worse. It started in the morning when I overexerted myself to answer a question someone asked me, and it felt like the right hemisphere of my brain caved in. From then on I had this occasional pulsing feeling in my head that would also trigger these visual distortions. People's faces also started to look like alien faces. I told all of this to someone and they told me to go to hospital. At the time I thought this was a bit unnecessary though, so I waited a few hours. But when things got worse I decided to call 000. So then I did have a brief hospitalization, but I actually ended up running away from hospital for a variety of reasons, which I'll describe in another video. My family quickly realized that something was very wrong and they contacted the crisis team. The crisis team met with me and I was put on 10 milligrams of olanzapine. The visual distortions went away almost immediately, but it took a few days for my delusions to reach their peak. There were so many delusions I could honestly talk about them for hours, so I'll just describe a few. I had a lot of what are called delusions of reference, and a lot of what are called persecutory delusions. There was one point where it was like I was being tormented by a TV show that my sister was watching in another room. One moment I would be thinking about getting a haircut. The next moment I would hear Donald Trump say on the TV show that there was going to be a really long line at the hairdresser. I was also being intensely tormented by social media, the internet, and books, which I felt like were passing me messages highlighting things that I was insecure about. For example, I was reading this book called You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. I started to see all these personal references in the book, to the point where I thought the book was actually about me and I was the main character. My own explanation for this was that someone must have been studying me in detail and had put all these references in the book. In hindsight, it's super bizarre, but it was very real at the time. One of the more scary delusions that was really an attempt for me to explain the other delusions that I was having went to the lines that I was actually in a simulation like the Matrix, and it turned out I'd lived my entire life in that simulation, but my connection to the Matrix had become faulty, and because of that, I was going to be put down or killed, which is what the crisis team were going to come and do. This died down in a couple of weeks, and I ended up going back to work. However, I was left with some very severe side effects from the medication that made work very difficult. Some of these side effects were actually getting worse. It was nearly 2 months after my first episode that I had my second episode. I'll talk about exactly how and why this happened in another video. But basically, my second episode was very different to my first. I had very different symptoms, it was much more treatment resistant, and I had to go onto a much higher dose of olanzapine to stabilise. Some of the symptoms I experienced as part of my second episode are fairly common. However, some others I understand are a little bit more rare. Some of the more common ones included having regular objects look distorted, people looking like they were moving in slow motion. I also had extreme depth perception issues that became really intense. One of the more rare symptoms I had was very scary. My facial processing basically broke. When I looked at people's faces, their facial features were totally out of proportion. It even got to the point where people's faces just looked like a total blur, or they looked like an alien. Another slightly unusual symptom was the presence of saccadic vision, which was like having a low visual frame rate, which was especially noticeable if I scanned a room. I also had terrible cognitive symptoms. It got so bad I could barely remember what I did that morning. This was also partially because I had to go onto a much higher dose of olanzapine. I basically didn't stabilise until I was on 18.5 milligrams a day, which is nearly double my first initial dose, and I had to start taking it during the day too. This meant I had much more side effects. One of the worst ones was something called akathisia, which I'll describe more in another video. Also after my second episode that I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a very difficult experience in itself. The worst of my symptoms cleared up within a month or two, but some lingered around for much longer. I basically entered into a phase characterised by slowly improving residual symptoms. Some of the symptoms that stuck around with me for a while included my saccadic vision, negative symptoms, some cognitive deficits, and my medication side effects. I ended up switching antipsychotics. I changed from olanzapine to Latuda. This resulted in a huge improvement in my side effect profile. Whilst the worst symptoms were behind me, I would say that this phase was almost just as difficult because I was learning to live with the remaining symptoms on a long-term basis. Progress became very slow, and it was also unclear whether things were going to get any better. I also returned to work, which presented a whole new set of challenges. Also, what helped a lot was the use of supplements, which I'll talk more about in another video. I also participated in a clinical trial. Over the last few months, my saccadic vision eventually stopped and my cognition has improved a lot. I'm generally doing quite well, but as is the case for most people with schizophrenia, recovery doesn't necessarily mean back to the way things were. I hope you enjoyed this recount. Please subscribe. I'm going to be doing a few more videos diving into specific topic areas, with the hope that it provides insight to both people who do and don't have the disease. Thanks for watching.